So I'm going to demonstrate a process I created for doing animation with ZBrush, kind of creating a Claymation style where each frame is a different mesh, and I can sculpt in kind of like 3D motion blur and smear frames, and also get some intersections between parts of the body with Dynamesh. So my background is that I've worked in the 3D industry for about 7 years, and always been working on developing my own short films and animations. But I realized there isn't really a great way to preserve kind of the expressiveness of a sculpt once it's rigged in T-pose and goes through the whole animation process and rendering. It tends to lose kind of some of the life that the original concept sculpt can have, and that you can see in 2D animation. So this process helps preserve that by kind of making each frame a separate sculpt and getting more of that artistic control. So initially, back in 2018, my idea was just to use separate subtools as keyframes and just do that within ZBrush and scroll back and forth to get the playback. But then after that, I developed some scripts in Maya where I can actually export a rigged animated character on each frame, and just take the mesh from each frame and send those into ZBrush where I can then sculpt over those. So here's the animation we're going to be creating in this demo. It's fairly simple, fairly quick, but it shows most of the aspects of the technique, like 3D sculpted motion blur, vertex colors, and overall it's a decent result in a relatively short amount of time for this process. All right, so we're starting out with this model that I created a while ago in ZBrush, and I created a rig for it using Rapid Rig Modular, which is a great rigging tool you can buy online. And if you want to get that, make sure you get Modular and not Rapid Rig Advanced. It's just an older version, doesn't work as well. So the idea here is he's gonna like rise up out of this mud stuff and rip open his belly, and then I'm not sure what will happen after that. Maybe a character will come out. At this point, I don't really know. And this is really the hardest part, because this is like where I come up with the concept of what the motion is going to be and how the different parts of the body are going to intersect and how that's going to all translate into ZBrush animation later. So for the most part, this is just standard Maya animation at this stage. I do some things differently, like I animate in 15 frames per second, and I don't use any splines. I only use stepped keys, and I try to key everything on the body on each frame, or not on each frame, on every key. All parts of the body are keyed. So I have some internal geometry already modeled into this guy, and here I'm just creating some blend shapes for that. So I can activate those whenever the hands are separating. I've got some wonky poses in here. And honestly, this part is just pretty painful. So here's my result from basically the first day of messing around. Just an idea of kind of standing up, opening up the belly. Doesn't look great, but it's just something to get started with. So back into Maya, I decided I actually want him to kind of come out of the water more diagonally. It felt like it was just too straight on. So as you can see, it's just a lot of swapping back and forth between keyframes. And I set hotkeys for Maya, where I can switch between keyframes with the A and D keys, which is a lot easier for me to access. And you can see I'm intersecting a lot of parts of the body. It's pretty crucial to the look I'm going for in ZBrush. I can dynamesh every part of the body together and get some cool effects with like motion trails across the different meshes. So at this point, I'm just trying to get poses that look cool, like sculpturally, but then also balancing that with getting motion that actually looks fluid. The main thing to consider there, really the 12 principles of animation, I guess, but the main ones that I follow for this is slow in and slow out. So that would be an object will accelerate slowly into a motion and then decelerate slowly out. And here I'm just adding a rock using Maya sculpting tools because I realize the pose that he's in, it's not really stable, so just add a rock for him to lean on. So yeah, I think about slow in and slow out, and also clean arcs, which is where any major part of the body that you can visually really see should be following somewhat of a smooth curve as it travels through space. And I don't really use reference for any of my animation because I think it kind of limits the options you can get visually, especially when I'm doing things that can't be done in real life, like parts of the body intersecting. But I do sometimes act things out with a timer on my phone. So like if I want the action of standing up out of a chair, I would do that in real life and time that and see how long that takes. And just see how the different parts of my body move as I go through that action. Like when my hands raise up and what curve they take as they go through space and stuff like that. But I don't really actually film anything. So at this point, I'm getting pretty frustrated actually with the process. I'm not really liking the pose that he's getting into. And since there's so many different things to track, like I have to track the way his spine is leaning back and the way his hands are separating, and also the way the mesh is splitting in the front. And when you have too many different things to track with animation, you tend to get some weird results because like if I want to adjust the position of the spine, I'd have to adjust the hands and the belly blend shapes, and it's just too many things to really keep in your mind at once to be able to adjust things smoothly. So I'm realizing that, and I'm going back in. I'm going to animate it without the blend shapes to start with, just moving the spine and the hands. So at that point, I was thinking, okay, that shot's not going to go anywhere, so I'm going to do something completely different. I'm going to have these giant hands taking this guy out of the mud and then like poking him. And it's just kind of goes to show how frustrated I was with the first shot. I didn't think it was going anywhere. So I think this looks kind of cool. One issue with this is that it's more difficult with my current setup to have two separate characters, and I didn't really have time to do a completely new shot. So okay, I dropped that. Going to a different new shot. He's going to be standing there. He's going to rip open, and then he's going to fall back. So worked on this new different shot for maybe an hour or two, and then kind of off screen, I guess I went back to the first shot and added some frames at the end, some poses that I think look quite a bit better actually. So now I'm gonna stick with that first shot. So sometimes I kind of go through crisis like that, and you just have to push through it and try to see if you can get something that looks interesting enough that you're gonna have fun continuing to work on it. I think that's really the key. Like once it gets to a certain point where you enjoy some part of the process and enjoy how it's looking, then you can really get something interesting out of it. So At this point, I added some more in-betweens, added some more frames at the end to kind of complete that motion, and I'm pretty happy with that motion at this point. So here in ZBrush, I'm just up-resing the rock using Dynamesh, and I use snake hook with a dots alpha, and then I just use an inflate brush with a square alpha on top of that. I'm trying to make sure it fits the dimensions of the original rock so it doesn't interfere with the animation at all, because his elbow has to lean on it at a certain place. Just doing some more tweaking on the rock. All right, so at this point I'm going to get into the blend shapes, which are sometimes they're called shot sculpting or just corrective shapes. Basically, it's just creating a blend shape in Maya and keying it at a certain point in time in the animation so that I can make the model look correct. I can re-sculpt it to look correct at that pose. The benefit of doing it here in Maya at this stage is that I can use keyframes to actually preserve that sculpt over a certain period of time rather than have a separate sculpt on every single frame, which is what we're going to do later in ZBrush. So here I'm just fixing the ridge muscles on the arm. This tends to be a pretty critical spot when the arm is bent. And just setting keys for that as it fades out. Now I'm using soft select to pull out those vertices. And the sculpting tools in Maya are not really great. They work all right for this. But again, it's just something to start with that we can go over later in ZBrush. So I'm moving on to his left arm, which is going to be reasonably visible. Through this whole process, I'm really thinking about what's visible from the actual render cam, which you can see in the upper right corner. I'm not going to really do anything that's not going to be visible to that camera. It's just wasted time, which is one major difference between pre-rendered animation and like game animation, where it has to be generally visible from any side. So just fixing the ridge muscles and the biceps there. And then I'm going to work on this final pose, because this is really the pose that will be seen for the longest period of time. So it needs to look pretty good, and since it's seen over several different keys, I need to do most of the sculpting in Maya so that I don't have to redo it on every frame. Okay, so back into ZBrush, I'm just doing some painting on the rock to make it blend in with the mud a little bit better. And this is just polypaint, which will be rendered as vertex color in Arnold. And then I'm going to do a test render where I've merged these different pieces together with vertex color. Just set up some basic light to see if the relative values of the rock and the mud and the guy are looking good. And here I'm tweaking the specular. I'm going to try to actually use the vertex color to increase the roughness on the lighter parts, and in this way I can have the mud shiny and the guy be more matte since he's a lighter color. So here I'm just merging and exporting a different pose to Maya to try out the lighting with this different pose, with the guy more bent forward. It's one of the hardest things with lighting for animation is that it can look good in a particular pose, a certain point in the animation, but it can not work for the rest of the motion. So in this case, it's clearly way too dark when he's leaning over. So I'll have to work on that later. So here I have a script that I wrote in ZBrush. It's just merging the plane and the rock onto each frame. So each frame is a separate subtool, and then I'm just merging those to each of those frames of the guy. And I also did that to delete any part of the guy that was not visible under the surface. So now we're getting into the ZBrush animation stage, and I haven't done any dynameshing at this point. I'm just making sure the different parts of the body are following arcs. So I'm just using the snake hook for the most part, maybe a little bit of smooth. And I'm also fixing there the deltoid with clay tubes. So I do some adjustments like this before I dynamesh anything, especially because I can isolate with topological masking. I can isolate different parts of the body, move them independently, and there's just a lower resolution to work with, so I can move things around more easily. So I'm just using A and D on my keyboard to go up and down the subtool list, and that's what gets the animated effect. Now here I'm working on a little bit of the smear motion blur on the hands as they fall, and just doing some corrections on the anatomy. I'm just going through whatever I think I can do before I start dynameshing, because once you start dynameshing, you're really losing some information too. Here, these first few frames, I'm working on a little bit of dynamesh, getting some merging with the mud. I'm mostly using clay tubes and standard brush with square alpha and with polypaint color enabled. And I'm just switching that back and forth between the white and the black colors. Just trying to get some of a more of a flow between the surface and the guy. And here I'm using the snake hook again to drag his head and neck as he comes out, just to get some more of that smear, make the motion look smooth. And snake hook is really my favorite brush. I use it for almost anything, either with no alpha and I just adjust the focal shift, or I use the dots alpha. And I'm doing some calculations there, seeing how many polygons I'm going to have roughly for each sculpt, because I want to go for probably under 30 million polygons total. When each frame is a separate mesh, you have to really think about that. And then I just dynamesh at the resolution that I need to get down to that number. Generally, if something is moving faster, I dynamesh at a lower resolution, because it's not going to be seen. You're not going to see details anyway when it's moving quickly. And it's also easier to stretch it out that way. So here I'm using again the snake hook with the dots alpha and just trying to create a look of some kind of tearing between the surface and his head. And I'm using some white polypaint value on that. Now here I'm using Sculptris Pro a little bit, which allows you to dynamically create new topology. And I just use that to pull out that little piece that's left behind floating in the air as he comes up. Now here I'm doing some smoothing. Since the polygons on the original mesh are still visible after dynameshing, I'm using smooth directional to just go through and smooth out some of that. But I use smooth directional because it only smooths in the direction of the stroke, and you can use this to preserve some details. Sometimes I want to actually create or keep some of those edges from the topology visible to create more definition in certain areas, and also just to keep the surface looking like it's alive throughout the animation. I don't want to smooth everything kind of indiscriminately. I want to smooth only areas that I don't like the way they look, or that are not really emphasized at that point in the animation. So generally, the things that should draw the eye more can be rougher and more textured and more like, I feel like they've actually been sculpted on, and the areas that are fading to the background should be more smooth. So I'm going back into the shoulder. I still don't like how it kind of looks like it's boiling a little bit. It's just too much difference between each frame. So I'm smoothing some of that out. I don't want it to draw too much attention because you should really be looking at the hand at this point. And I'm fixing some anatomy on the arm there. It's a little risky to try to fix anatomy at this stage because it's going to tend to jump around a little bit. It's just too difficult to really keep things consistent from one frame to the next. But minor tweaks, are possible. And generally, the more is done at this stage, the more interesting the final result is, because you can see, more of a handmade look throughout the whole animation. But it's a lot more work. So again, I'm using smooth directional to kind of smooth some of those intersections. And ideally, each frame is going to look like an interesting animation on its own. And that's kind of one of the benefits of this process. The extent to which you go there is really dependent on how much time you have to work on it. But ideally, each frame is going to contribute to the look, and it should be cool no matter where the viewer pauses the animation. So here I'm creating some motion trails on the fingers as they travel up the body, some grooves, and also some trails on the water surface, the mud surface. And also a little bit of a pile up on the flesh as it gets pushed up by the arm. So I'm just going constantly back and forth with A and D, making sure things flow smoothly, and I'm following arcs and slow in and slow out. One thing that's interesting when you're doing this in Maya or in ZBrush is each subtool has its own undo history. So it's a little different to get used to that, but it's actually really useful. because you can really undo everything. If you don't like how one particular sculpt is going, you can go back to the start on that without affecting anything else. And I'm also constantly saving iterations. Whenever I think something looks decent, I will save that, and then I'll save a new version immediately. And that gives me a bit more confidence for making drastic changes to things. I know that I can go back if I have to, and I can even take particular frames from a previous version and import them into this new version if I really mess one up. So I'm just figuring out how I want the motion to go on these hands. I'm not really sure exactly how I want these to look, whether I want them to drag the surface of the liquid with them a little bit, or the focus to be more on just the motion trail through the body. This is all pretty experimental. You can see I'm fixing some of that leg issue too. That will be fixed later on. There's a bit of a dent in the leg that needs to be filled in. So there I'm using the standard brush with the square alpha, and I like to use that because it's pretty rough. You kind of have to learn how to sculpt really quickly if you're going to use this method of animation too, because in this case I have 49 different subtools, 49 different sculptures. It's going to take a while if you don't know how to sculpt this quickly. So I tend to use brushes that are more harsh, like snake hook or standard, and just get the basic idea in there really fast. So now here I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do for when this belly splitting open. I'm thinking of using snake hook with the dots alpha just to get some of that stretching. I'm not really happy with these initial attempts at this, so I'm going to actually mask out this edge. And a nice trick is you can press Ctrl H after you create a mask, and it will hide it. So then I'm able to sculpt that part out without affecting anything else. And I'm using Sculptris Pro again to create some extra resolution there on those strands. One thing that's a bit difficult there is making sure the strands are actually pointed towards the other side of the mesh rather than pointed inside of the body. For the most part, I'm actually sculpting from the render camera view, which I imported into ZBrush. Lots of smoothing. Has to be done on every frame really, but I think in this case I might have gone a little overboard, trying to avoid dealing with the issue of how I'm going to make those parts of the body split apart. Tend to procrastinate by just smoothing things too much. Okay, so finally I'm going back to masking on the next frame. So I'm trying to get a bit of an arc as the the pieces pull apart, kind of suggesting that gravity is pulling down on those strands. At this point, I'm not really sure how much I want them to appear to fall as it opens. I'm also trying to decide how thick these strands will be, whether they're going to be just like strings or actually appear to be parts of the mesh that are getting pulled apart. Like here it's a bit thicker. Kind of decided I don't really want it to be that thick. Just making them more like strings again. And at this point, I don't know what's going to happen inside of his body after this opens. Again, it's all just kind of experimental. Originally, I thought maybe there'd be some kind of like hand that pops out or something, but I didn't want to involve a completely separate character rig to have to animate. So again, just adding some remaining little pieces, and I'm trying to decide how much those are going to fall as they come apart. They need to fall a bit to make it look realistic, but it's not really the focus of it either, though. So you can see there when I'm using the smooth directional brush on the fingers, I'm leaving the edge along the top surface of each finger, which is kind of indicating the tendon. And that's kind of nice to be able to use the topology for that detail without having to sculpt that in separately. It's another reason to not smooth everything uniformly. So here I'm animating, or I'm importing back into Maya to check it out, how it looks in the Playblast, just with a script that I wrote to import those frames. So here's my first Playblast coming out of ZBrush into Maya, and it's clearly way too slow. Otherwise, it's looking interesting. So here I'm using a tool that I wrote to change the timing, which is just moving around the keyframes for the visibility channel of each of these meshes. Before I had to do this manually, but this is much, much easier. So I just go on the frame where a mesh is visible and then do shorten or lengthen. So here it's retimed, it feels a lot snappier. So now I'm back in ZBrush. I noticed I need some motion trails on these hands as they fall, because I don't use any motion blur, which wouldn't work anyway because I'm rendering each mesh separately. So there's no actual motion for the renderer to calculate. So all motion blur is just sculpted in 3D. So I'm adding some smear to the face as well with snake hook again. Now I decide I'm going to add some liquid inside of his body that pours out. So again, this is just an experiment. I wasn't sure if this would go anywhere. But I'm using pretty strong standard brush with 100% RGB intensity to just build up some lumps in there. I'm going to see if I can make those kind of pour out as it opens up. And this type of thing is really probably the most fun to do. This is where it really feels like claymation. So I'm trying to figure out how far up this water level should be inside there, and how quickly it should descend. And something that's pretty important at this stage is that I do all of this animation in one session. So for this liquid, it should be done pretty much all in one sitting if I can. Otherwise, my technique is going to change, and you're going to see some differences as the animation proceeds. So I'm trying to find a material that will allow me to see that a little bit better, even though it's so dark. And I'm using the standard brush to build up most of the form in there, but then I dynamesh, and then I use clay tubes to create that front part of the liquid where it's actually pouring out. This clay tubes has a lot more control, a lot easier to get it to be a bit flat in the front, and it's more of a subtle effect. I have embed on the clay tube set pretty high. It's probably like 16 or 18. So it's still a pretty harsh effect, just because, you know, we have to get each frame done pretty quickly. So here's a better material with some specular, so I can see what's going on better. I'm just deciding how quickly, again, that water level should descend. And I want the flow to kind of reflect the way his body moves as it falls backward. So it's kind of the flow is going to decrease a little bit at first, and then it's going to increase again as he falls back. It's like the liquid is sloshing around in there. So I'm testing it again in Maya just to see how things are playing back at full speed. It looks all right. Just need to keep going. Gotta make sure the water level remains about the same. It's going down too quickly right now. So at this point, it's definitely feeling like stop motion, where it just feels like there's so many frames that have to be created. You just have to keep going through them. There's no in-betweens or splines provided, so you really have to create everything yourself. But it's also part of what makes it fun. So you can see there I pressed N to get the subtool pop-up menu, which you can use to just select any subtool in your current tool, I guess. It's pretty convenient. And also throughout this whole ZBrush animation stage, I've been using a script that I wrote where I can just copy the previous Dynamesh settings, and I'm using that a lot here. Whenever I Dynamesh something, I'll just copy the settings from the previous subtool, and then depending on if the motion is getting faster, I'll just reduce the resolution a little bit and progressively reduce that as the motion gets faster, and then bring it back up as the motion slows down. But that just speeds up the process a bit. So just a few more frames to go here, and then I should be done with most of the animation. I think I still have to tweak some of the motion trails in the hands that they fall, and add a little bit of an impact ripple where the hand hits the mud. But that was done off screen. So this is getting pretty close to being finished. And as he settles back in the final pose, the liquid just kind of settles in his stomach. It stops leaking out. I figured out that was probably the best, most easy way to kind of resolve the motion of it. All right, so I'm back in Maya. I'm just tweaking some vertex colors, and then I'm going to be changing the lighting since we determined before that it was too much shadow on the front of the guy as he bent over. So added some environment light and a bounce light. Then I have one main spotlight and then one that's broader and a bit dimmer, which just allows me to control the fall off a little bit better. And then I'm going to add 2 rim lights to light the back of his arm and the back of the rock. I'm just going to turn off specular on those so they don't show up too much on the plane of the mud. And then I'm adding a spotlight also to his face. And I'm using Arnold GPU for this, which is super fast. I can get a pretty decent render in 1 second, which makes it super great for actually doing a preview render of the entire animation. So here's the final result. This took about a week overall, and I'm pretty happy with it. It was a bit of a struggle at the first part, as it always is, just trying to figure out what direction I'm going with it. But after that, it was a lot of fun. There's still things that I can see here that I would probably want to change. That's really how it is with every piece of artwork for me. There's always something I'd want to change, but it's best to just move on to the next one. But yeah, overall, I'm pretty happy with this. You can check out my work on ArtStation and Instagram. And I also posted a set of scripts on Gumroad that you can use to make your own ZBrush Claymation. Also, please send me links to any animations you create using this process. I'd love to see them.